process that includes virtually all of our local agencies. We do have abundant surface water resources, so groundwater can be used sustainably and is coordinated with our surface water supplies. Our collaborative spirit is truly demonstrated by the fact that our Solano County Water Agency Board is composed of all of our members of our Board of Supervisors, all the 7 mayors of all the mayors of all of our 7 cities, the directors of our 3 irrigation districts. So we do have all of our water users represented in a single place. We do not have the geology to direct recharge of groundwater basins through groundwater recharge ponds, so we must and do carefully monitor groundwater levels and their use. Our SWRCB, which is what we call our water agency, coordinates our groundwater monitoring, research, and reporting. The cities and the districts that pump groundwater are all involved with our groundwater activities. While long-term monitoring shows that our groundwater levels are not declining, we are currently investigating if those groundwater basins can be utilized more in the future as our water demands increase. SWRCB also funds our geotechnical studies of the groundwater basins and has installed groundwater monitoring wells and land subsidence monitors. SWRCB has sponsored a pilot groundwater conjunctive use project where agricultural districts pump groundwater instead of using their surface water and transfer the unused surface water to cities. This type of program could be expanded if groundwater needs increase in the future. We also have received state grants to do research on groundwater basins and to study conjunctive use on groundwater. So those are the practices that we undertake in Solano County and are satisfied that we are serving our constituents very well in that regard. So with that, I'd just like to say, in summary, thank you very much for inviting counties to participate in this process, and thank you for your time this morning. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Linda. And finally, we have Vanessa.
Good morning. I'm Vanessa de la Piedra with the Santa Clara Valley Water District. We are the groundwater management agency, treated water wholesaler, and watershed steward for the 1.8 million residents of Silicon Valley. Our agency is a special district that was formed in 1929 to address groundwater overdraft and land subsidence that totaled over 13 feet in downtown San Jose. For more than 80 years, our water supply strategy has been to maximize reliability through conjunctive water management. We depend on groundwater to meet nearly half of our annual water needs, and we manage our basins to be the primary reserve during droughts. So in years like this, we're drawing even more heavily on our basins. Our success in sustainably managing groundwater is based on a strong local framework, and key authorities and tools available to us are first and foremost the authority to implement and fund conjunctive water management projects. Additional tools are clear basin management goals and adequate data to assess basin conditions, and I'll touch on each of those over the next few minutes. Our District Act gives us the statutory authority to protect and augment groundwater resources and to levy groundwater production charges to fund related efforts. And with the support of the community, we've made significant investments in groundwater replenishment and also in lieu groundwater recharge through the provision of treated water supplies and also through water conservation and recycling programs. And together, those efforts have had a dramatic effect in restoring groundwater storage and halting permanent land subsidence in our county. We have clear basin management objectives, and these are derived from our District Act and our Board of Directors policy. We have a 7-member elected board that has adopted our groundwater management plan. That's our guiding document in terms of groundwater management. It identifies our local basin management objectives, as well as sustainable targets for groundwater storage, groundwater quality, and land subsidence. And we update that document on a 5-year basis to make sure that it's continually up to date. So in order to measure our performance against those goals, obviously we need to have a good understanding of basin conditions and be able to evaluate changes to the basin. So to that end, we conduct extensive monitoring of water levels, groundwater quality, and land subsidence. And we monitor hundreds of wells throughout our county every year. We meter water use, and we also measure and manage recharge, which allows us to evaluate our groundwater budget. We use groundwater models to be able to forecast water levels and groundwater storage under various water supply scenarios, different hydrologies. and that's a very helpful tool that we use very often, and more so in years like this. I think we're running those every month. We perform regular assessment of basin conditions in relation to these groundwater management plan targets. That helps us to assess whether the programs that we have in place are doing what we need them to do, whether we need to modify those programs or develop new initiatives, and also informs our operational decisions. An example of that is in our water shortage contingency plan, the stages for various demand reduction measures are based on the projected end-of-year groundwater storage. With regard to groundwater quality, we have the authority to implement a well ordinance program. We register and permit new wells and also permit the destruction of wells, and that's a way for us to ensure that those activities are done in a way that won't impair drinking water aquifers. We work closely with local water retailers and basin stakeholders, and we make information on basin conditions readily available to the public through reports and other data that's accessible through our website. So these are just a few examples of some of the authorities and tools that have served us well in Santa Clara County. In terms of additional tools that would be helpful, one potential tool is the ability to allocate or influence pumping through fees, particularly during dry years. This can include financial disincentives for pumping above allocated amounts, potentially with those funds going towards securing additional water supplies if they're available, or funding programs to reduce demands on the basin, such as conservation and recycling. Opportunities to increase conjunctive management are key to protecting against overdraft and addressing droughts, climate change, and other risks. And local agencies need adequate tools and funding to secure supplemental water supplies and implement projects to either add water to the basin using raw water or recycled water, or to reduce demands, again, through conservation and recycling. And the state can support these efforts by reducing barriers to the implementation of those types of projects and by providing technical assistance and funding. An improved statewide water system, including long-term resolution of delta ecosystem and conveyance constraints and completion of state and regional storage projects, would also support more sustainable groundwater management by furthering conjunctive use. Lastly, I'll just echo some of the comments from others on the panel that stronger partnerships are needed between land use agencies and groundwater management agencies. And I would also extend that to regulatory agencies to be sure that we're protecting groundwater quality and recharge areas in accordance with local needs. We concur that a one-size-fits-all approach isn't appropriate for groundwater management, and that it is best addressed at the local level. And maintaining the flexibility for local agencies to manage groundwater for local conditions and stakeholder interests is key. Existing authorities and tools have resulted in well-managed basins in many areas, and we can build upon these approaches to further sustainable groundwater management throughout the state. We appreciate the opportunity to provide input today with this workshop and look forward to continuing to be involved. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to take some questions from the panel.
I'll start. I think this is mostly for John and Eric, but everybody else can feel free to chime in too. It seems like both of you have some variation on the problem of a basin or a sub-basin that spans multiple jurisdictions, and getting everybody on the same page around some basin management objectives is an issue. And I was just wondering if you feel like the current tools available, Joint Powers Authority or other negotiated agreements, or getting a special act, are those adequate, or do you feel like there's something else that needs to be out there to help resolve that kind of problem?
I think one of the issues is who's going to lead in each basin. In our basin, we look at ourselves as leaders in water management, but other folks may not necessarily see it that way. We're holistic in our conjunctive program. We're a net positive on the aquifer, but because of the other activities around us, the aquifer still suffers a bit. So I think that we're working towards cooperative relationship. We're unique in that I think that we're small enough under the way that our earwimp is put together that it's nimble enough and small enough that we can probably get this figured out. But other basins south of us have so many water districts and so many cities that I don't think that model would specifically work for them. So I'm not as concerned at our local level, but I know that there's a big concern at these other levels, that there's much more complicated circumstances that they're going to have to deal with. But even with that, I mean, these are going to be very difficult decisions that are going to have to be made, and it's going to take leadership to do that. And I really don't have the answer for you. I wish I did, but I think, again, a reasonable amount of time to figure out how these decisions are going to be made, and if they can be made with, some backstops, is the appropriate place to be.
Well, just to tag on to that before you go, Eric, is what is a reasonable amount of time from your perspective?
Well, I would suggest, as I discussed, that you need the tools. You have to do the monitoring. You have to set up the models. You have to run the models. And most of us know what's happening in the basin, but you have to educate everybody else within the basin as to what's happening and how you can manage the circumstance without creating too much damage based on prior decision making. So every basin's different. The ones that aren't where we are, it's probably going to take a couple years. Even when you get the models developed, it takes, I think we're 18 months away from being able to identify everything and educate everybody. And then that's when we're going to have to start real decision making. So I would say these basins didn't get to their conditions overnight. It took a while. And I would suggest that a 5-6 year time frame would be appropriate. It may sound like a long time, but again, there are a lot of educational and political obstacles at the local level that have to be overcome.
If I could just add, it will be a significant challenge. Within Kern County, we have dozens of large water districts and potentially 100 small water districts, not to mention cities, and just the complexity of bringing those groups together. It pains me greatly to say this, but there is a template that I think we may be looked at, which is the Irrigated Lands Regulatory Program, which created an incentive for those who are willing to step forward and address the issue, and it allowed the backstop for those that weren't. And it does pain me greatly to say that, but I think that we need to have a structure that acknowledges and rewards those that come to the table and say we're willing to do our part, and it doesn't penalize them if some one or two entities within that basin choose not to. So we need to make sure to balance that.
So yeah, I was, hopefully you can hear this. I was curious, both John and Eric mentioned the economic challenges potentially with demand management. Eventually you may get to that point where you have to evaluate, reducing demand. And I was curious if in your models, if you consider the economics associated with potential demand management down the road at all, or is that not included in the modeling? And then maybe for Santa Clara, I mean, how did they? Obviously, you've been fairly successful of curbing, the overdraft and subsidence, and was the economics of the actions you've taken into consideration? So,
We have not, but that is going to be part of the assessment. It has to be. If it goes where it appears it's heading, which is reduced groundwater pumping, it's going to have huge impacts on land values, taxes, employment, all those types of things, and that needs to be understood. And I think that's one of the issues that needs to be understood by everybody, including the state, before we jump too fast and come up with quote-unquote solutions. I mean, I think it's important we understand the economic impacts immediately versus the long-term sustainability, and try to find something that works, understanding both circumstances. And that's a big hurdle.
right.
I would agree with John. We've asked the Kern Economic Development Corporation to look at the potential impacts within Kern County, and it extends to tax bases, employment. It's very broad, and I don't think we have a firm grasp yet, and I want to make sure that that information is available as the legislature investigates or considers potential regulatory restrictions on groundwater, that they understand the impacts associated with that. It shouldn't be done in a vacuum.
And so with that, would you also evaluate the impacts of doing nothing, economic impacts? Okay.
Yeah.
And then I was just curious.
Fortunately, we've been in the situation where we've been able to implement enough conjunctive management projects that we haven't been in danger of not meeting demands. But it is becoming more challenging as with growth in the future and other risks. So, we're looking to expand conjunctive use. So an example is recycle water. We're pushing to construct a new advanced treatment facility that should greatly expand the use potentially in the future within our county, with the recognition that we have to do something to protect the economy of Silicon Valley. I mean, there's not really an option for us. We have to implement projects to meet the demands.
I'm curious, there's been a good conversation about the relationship between water quality and supply. Do you all have any ideas about how, or opinions about if or how we might streamline how you report, or how you monitor and then how you report on water quality and supply?
I'll just jump in here. As an agency that collects a lot of data every year and makes that available, I think we would be somewhat concerned with statewide efforts and consistency. We are the designated agency for the CASGEM program, so we do reporting on that. But it is somewhat of a concern because we're already producing these we do annual groundwater report that's very comprehensive in terms of pumping, subsidence monitoring, water quality. We have actually at this point monthly summary reports that we're putting out on water supply conditions that are available on our website. So from our perspective, it is somewhat duplicative and it poses a bit of a burden in terms of any forced additional statewide reporting. I understand the need for statewide assessments and, Bulletin 118 and other avenues like that are a great way to evaluate on a statewide basis. But it does cause some potential concern for us because we already are making so much data available to our local stakeholders.
Yeah, maybe if I can rephrase my question, because what I was actually asking is, are there opportunities to streamline, to collect both level and quality data at the same time for whoever, whether it's for your use at the local level or some kind of reporting that would happen to the state?
If I could speak to that briefly, whether it's ILRP, CASGEM, there's a new SB4 that came out for oil field. There are dozens of reports that are required to different entities. And I had it on my list of incentives, but I was getting too long on the list and didn't want to seem greedy. But one of the things that I think would be very helpful is the ability to look at a high level and say, why are we collecting 5 data points with going to 5 different agencies and duplicating costs? And so to the extent that there are opportunities, I can think of 2 or 3 off the top of my head that would allow us to consolidate one report that then could go to the state and be disseminated to the agencies separately.
Oh, just a question, and this is perhaps a function coming out of local government. And I know how jealously we guarded the land use authority that we had. And so I'd be interested in you all talking about just different ways we should be thinking about that. If talking about groundwater at the state level was forbidden for many years, and now there's a lively and historic, I think, discussion going on among people with open minds about what we ought to do, and I thank you all for engaging in this with us. I'd be interested in hearing just how that can work in the most appropriate way, because land use is another thing that, while the state has some authority over the planning regime, is also something that we sometimes step carefully. So I'd just be curious about how you did it in Santa Clara Valley, maybe because you're the same thing or you're that close to the county and city land use authorities. Professor, I would love to hear about examples in other states and how they do it at the statewide level. And then for you all, just observations, again, what we should be bearing in mind as we try to figure out how to find the sweet spot that helps make this work better for folks.
So I'll just start in our area. We have some good examples of working with local land use agencies. A recent example is our county was revising their septic system ordinance. They formed a working group and we participated with them, and they were very receptive to input. One of the challenges that we find is, I think there are 15 cities within our county, and the county also oversees the rural areas. Each agency is struggling to do more with less, while many of the agencies, most of them, have very good language in their general plans about the connection to water quality and water supply. It's a bit challenging at the project level to make that connection, so we're working to more actively engage with them. I know there was some legislation recently that there was a requirement to send maps of the recharge areas to local land use agencies. And we've done some of those efforts, but we're finding it is a bit challenging because everyone's so focused on their individual missions to make that connection. So that's something that we all need to work on at the local level for sure, is improving that coordination.
I mean, the question about other states is a difficult one because the most prominent examples are one where there's such a strong central regulatory control on water management. So if you take, for example, Arizona, where there's such a strong requirement that if you build anything or have any change in land use that increases water demand, you have to offset that demand by saving water somewhere else. In the context of the present discussion, it's a little bit difficult to imagine how that would be implemented in California, although some jurisdictions in California are doing something like that, but through local authorities. And so that begs the question of exactly what the state's role is. I would say there's a broader issue, and that is, I was thinking about this in the discussion of the economics of restricting, of demand management, and that is I think there has to be some mechanism to link the shared vision for the growth of the community with the water management plan. You know, and so in the community's general plans, there's sort of a clear expression of the vision for the future growth of the community, and even the small step of making sure. And some communities have done this. Again, there's lots of examples around the state, but even making sure that the vision of the community that's enunciated in the general plan, that the water demand and aspects of that future water demand are clearly spelled out, and that's consistent with the plans of the different jurisdictions that have authority for managing and supplying water. Even that would be an important step. But I'm happy to talk about that in more detail elsewhere.
Suggesting, I think the incorporation of policy within the general plans needs to be respected. But more than anything, I think that just really repeating some of what I said earlier is really where I would go in response to your question, and that is that respecting local authority, doing what's only minimally necessary or determined to be minimally necessary, and delegating to local counties and local agencies the authority to implement those practices that will best meet their unique circumstances and need, and then providing the resources in order to incent that are really where I think is the best way to really protect the interests that you're talking about, and will really allow us to be more responsive to your concerns and to the broader concerns. Thank you.
I just have a follow-up on that, Linda. So I appreciate those comments, but what would you consider minimally necessary?
You're talking to a policymaker that's not an expert in water management by any stretch of the imagination. And so the truth of the matter is that's not really a question that I'm really qualified or prepared to address. But if you want me to find the experts that can speak from a county perspective, and I know that you will, we can do that. And one of the things I didn't say earlier is that there will be some additional comments in response to this workshop coming from CSAC, and I do hope that they will address that question specifically. And I think that just really taking a look at this as a broad issue. I think it's something that we're all, it's sort of, I always say that every issue has a tipping point, and what's interesting about groundwater and how it sort of has come to all of a sudden this new tipping point, which I think raises its profile, raises the issues and the questions that surround it, and really makes us all focus in a new and a different way on the importance of it, and how we integrate it into some of the broader issues that we discuss as policymakers. And so from the policy perspective, I mean, I really have to say that I appreciate and thank all of you for sort of moving this to a new kind of agenda. At least it seems like a new agenda for us in the county that I come from, that we've focused so much on other aspects of water management and other issues related to water, that really kind of beginning to take a look at how groundwater can, how it can be an addition, how it can be a new resource in a different way on the overall perspective is something that I think is good for us who really have been looking at some of the other water issues in different way, or predominantly from that, is that how can this really add to the discussion and add to the framework of what we've all been talking about. Thank you.
Thank you. When you give that additional feedback, I think one of the things we're hearing is on the ground circumstances are so different everywhere. If there are differences of opinion because of the local circumstances as to what is minimally necessary, explaining what those local circumstances on the ground that lead to those differences of opinion would be really critically important for all of us.
Great, I appreciate that. And Karen Keene from CSAC is in the audience today, and I know will address those, or has certainly heard the request. So thank you very much.
Well, just real quick, I mean, there is a disconnect between private property rights and the ability to put in a well and use that water for reasonable beneficial use, and the counties generally have that permitting authority, and at least in our area, you don't generally want to say no, but it's, quite frankly, that's some of what's led to where we are today. And as a conjunctive management district within that basin, we're about 20% of the basin. There's a frustration in that in a general plan they may evaluate to a minimum requirement. We may comment. Our comments may not be taken into account, and things keep moving. You really don't want to be that agency that takes on that other agency. So I don't have the answer for you, but there is a big disconnect there. And the private property right, the permitting, and who's the managing water agencies, there's three different things happening there that need to be addressed to coordinate for planning.
Perhaps maybe one final thought. There are existing frameworks, and I don't remember the number, but the Costa-Cua legislation is applicable to the urban side, where a development of 500 units or more needs I think it's a will serve. And I mentioned that in my presentation, that strengthening or potentially looking at that as one way of creating that connection. You're not usurping the permitting process, but you're informing it by saying, yes, I do in fact have a water supply available to meet that well or that development or that field of agriculture. But that linkage is critical. Absent that, we're back at square one. We have no authority and we have no ability to manage demand. So.
Thank you all very much. I feel like we could really continue this conversation all day, but thank you all for your insight. And we're going to take another 10-minute break and then reconvene for an additional panel before lunch. Thank you.
right to left? Four. Which four miles? I am. So it's just right arrow advances it? Yes.
Okay, let's start settling back in here. Okay, our next panel is going to be focused on the financing. I'm going to introduce who we have as they settle in. We have Ellen Hannock, a senior fellow at the Public Policy Institute of California. Michael Marcus, general manager, Orange County Water District. Dave Bolin, senior regulatory advocate of the Association of California Water Agencies. And Robert Reeb, executive director of the Valley Ag Water Coalition. Thank you all for being here today, and I think Ellen will start with you.
Well, good morning, everybody. Thanks for having me. So I think I got asked to participate in this because we were talking, maybe was it last week, with you all about a new report that we just came out with on water finance. So Gordon said to me, okay, great, so you've got it all done. You can just come and talk to us about this. And I said, but you want me to talk about groundwater, right? And he said, yeah. And then I sort of said, well, we did talk about that a little bit in the report, but so what I'm going to give you is, a bit from what we did in the report. We also tried, since you asked me to participate, to scramble a little bit and pull together a few more numbers, and I'm really glad we've got folks who know those numbers better on the panel too. But so let me just start by, thinking about what do agencies need money for, right? If we want to worry about financing. So what are the challenges? And you heard some of this morning already. You need to be able to cover the costs of management and oversight for a couple different kinds of things. One is just sort of getting a handle on basin water use, groundwater levels, characteristics of the basin, potential to use the basin and to work the basin. So that those are really monitoring tools and sometimes infrastructure, including specialized wells, modeling, those kinds of things. That's where my sense is there's been a lot more progress made in California in the last 20 years than maybe in some of the next steps that I'm going to talk about, which is that you also need money to implement recharge and conjunctive use programs, typically. And that, you think about pumping and conveyance infrastructure to be able to hook you up to the existing grids, and also supplemental water costs. And so some of the places that, like you heard Santa Clara, they're able to bring it to pay for the supplemental water that comes in, and that's been a key part of being able to manage the basin sustainably. And if you think about supplemental water, we're thinking not just about imported water, which was sort of the traditional model, and really one of the reasons why the Central Valley Project got built, one of the reasons why the State Water Project was so attractive, but also some of the new kinds of supplemental water, which is recycled wastewater and stormwater. So those are sort of, if you're going to manage a groundwater basin, you need money to do all those things, and you need to get it from somewhere. But I would say that there's another reason that you need money or fee authority, which is more about preventing people from using the basin too much. And that's sort of prevention of excessive use through a fee, a kind of a surcharge or a penalty. And that's especially important in places that are not adjudicated, where you've got to be able to, people don't have their individual use rights, so you got to be able to say, okay, and at a certain point it's going to get really expensive if you use more. And I think we heard Santa Clara say this morning that they wish they had the ability to do that. Some other places do right now in California. So where have agencies been getting the cash for doing the things that they do, recognizing that we have some groundwater management entities that have been in business for a long time and are doing a lot? They typically have either an adjudication that's backing them up or a special act district kind of arrangement. But then we also have all of these sort of more loosely managed AB 3030 type entities. I think it's really important to distinguish between that group that's sort of got some special authority to do things either through the adjudication or the special act district status versus everybody else. So the ones with special fee authority, they've been able to charge basin users. Now, it's not exactly the same in every case, but there's been definitely more ability to do that than in the case of the sort of more recent generation of AB 3030 type groundwater entities. So we looked this, and this is where the data, just give you a few data points on this. Up on DWR's website, they mentioned there are 13 special act groundwater management agencies created by the legislature. We found evidence of 5 of them, and those are really the big ones, that are charging fees right now. And these, that includes Santa Clara, that includes Orange County, includes Pajaro Valley Water Management Agency, includes Fox Canyon, and Desert Water Agency Coachella. And there may be others out there that are doing it. It just wasn't easily available for us to find quickly. If you look at what these agencies charge, it varies. The amounts vary, and of course that's going to vary some by what the cost of replacement water is for them, and so on. But they're also within the agencies. You'll see that the fees will sometimes vary by ag versus non-ag users, and I think my neighbor here is going to talk to you a little bit more about that in Orange County. Sometimes you also see it vary by location. That's the case in Santa Clara. They distinguish between the North Basin and the South Basin. Also, ag-urban is relevant for them. And then sometimes by levels of use. So as this idea of sort of tiered rates and even kind of a penalty surcharge. And I think both Orange County probably has that capability. Fox Canyon also has that capability, but obviously not everyone does. So then you look at the adjudicated basins, and as of last count, 22 of them, mostly in Southern California, excuse me. Now these all allocate use rights. Some of them do also charge replenishment fees. And in some cases with a replenishment district, like the Water Replenishment District of Southern California, which does that for a couple of the adjudicated basins down there. Chino Basin is an example of that. Mojave Basin is an example of that. It looks like those are pretty uniform. Those tend to be uniform replenishment fees and I imagine are linked to the cost of replacement water. I would just note an interesting little sidebar on this, which is that in these basins, you sometimes have the ability for water users to pay each other to help manage the sustainable yield. And so both in Chino and in Mojave, there's an active water market where essentially you're paying somebody else not to use their water, which might be something to think about in some of these other non-adjudicated areas where a tree crop farmer, orchard crop farmer might want to make sure they have reliable supplies over the long term and pay another farmer who doesn't have that kind of investment to forbear his water use or her water use. Now, what about all of the management entities without these special authorities to get money? How do they do it? I'm going to use a technical term here. They scrounge around for funds. Okay, that's kind of it's an art, and a lot of talent goes into that. Scrounging around means looking for local tax revenues, seeing if the local urban users, like in Sonoma County, are willing to throw in a bit of cash. Grant mentioned that as a sort of way that some of the efforts have been funded. I'm sure that in some cases, some of the big irrigation districts are also putting in a little bit of money, but that can't go super far. That's not going to get you replacement water. That might help you with monitoring and getting sort of some conversations going. There also is a model that's kind of interesting in some places, especially in Kern County, when you can operate groundwater banking for third parties. That's a way of getting some money to do some of the infrastructure that can help also just with local conjunctive use management. And then state bonds, and you've heard from most of the speakers from the local agencies about how valuable that is. DWR gave us information on this last year. As of late 2012, about $350 million had gone into groundwater storage projects from three bond acts, so Prop 13, Prop 50, and Prop 84. Obviously useful, but it can't replace the ability for locals to do better. So key barriers today and possible potential solutions. We talk a lot in our new report on water finance about Prop 218 type issues, and a number of folks earlier this morning have mentioned this. And if we were having this workshop in August of last year, I would have given you a much more depressing view of the ability of local entities to raise money for water management and groundwater basins than I am now, and that's because of a case that was decided at the appellate level in the fall in for Pajaro Valley Water Management Agency. This was a Prop 218 case, and in our view, the court really came down on the right side, and I think that this is at least now, for now, this is the precedential case. The Supreme Court chose not to review, and the basic idea is one that water agencies are facing more generally, which is are the courts going to interpret the substantive provisions of Prop 218, which require that the fees to a water user be proportional to the cost of service to their property and only reflect the services delivered to that property. Now, if you interpret that very narrowly, you can go down a rabbit hole with something like groundwater management, where the exact impacts and the exact benefits at this point in time for replenishment activity or management activity are not going to be identical across the basin, even though hydrological connections mean that if I'm up gradient and I'm pumping, or I'm inland from the coast and I'm pumping, I'm going to affect the guys who are right on the coast and who are going to be experiencing the saltwater intrusion. So the lawsuit that came in against Pajaro Valley, which was charging replenishment or augmentation fee, was this kind of argument that it's not, I'm not benefiting enough from this cost. The appellate court ruled that it is an integrated basin, it's a water service, that things like paying for recycled water, recharge, stormwater recharge are all relevant, and no matter where you are in the basin, that's relevant. That's a very important thing for all those entities that already have that kind of special authority, and I think you want to think about that in terms of what authority would be given to the other folks. Another very important piece of that decision was that the court ruled it is a water service, which means that it's still subject to the accountability and transparency required with public noticing and a public hearing on any rate increases, but it does not require a direct vote of the water users every time you want to raise the rates. And that's really important, because what we found in our study more generally looking at the water sector is that the only parts of the sector that are in good shape are those where they have that transparency and accountability at that level, but they don't have to actually get people to vote affirmatively every time they want to raise a rate. And that's the urban water utilities and the wastewater utilities are in that situation. So thinking forward, the main obstacle and the main area for solutions is extending more flexible authority like that you have in the special act districts in particular to the AB 3030s. And I think that Rob Reed is going to talk more about that, so I don't want to get into details, just to say that my reading of AB 3030 is that there are a lot of voter hurdles there still, in addition to probably not enough flexibility of the kinds of things that they can charge for. So the key is flexibility and making sure our laws now, Prop 218 and Prop 26 for that matter, both require a lot of transparency and accountability. So I think you don't want people to have to go to the voters every time they want to raise a rate. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. Next we have Michael.
Yes, thank you very much for inviting me here today. And I think it is refreshing to see the cross-section of groundwater agencies up and down the state and their stories, what they have to tell, because we're all a little bit unique. We all approach things a little bit differently. But hopefully we'll be able to learn from one another so that we can manage the basins in California in the most effective manner. So I wanted to start out with a little history. Orange County Water District was formed in 1933 by a special act of the state legislature. So as has been mentioned before, we are a special district. We encompass 229,000 acres in Orange County and provide groundwater for about 2.4 million people. So the map up there shows our service area, And what's kind of interesting is our act also says that anyone within the basin, we are a non-adjudicated basin, so anyone within the basin can sink a well within the basin, pump water out, and they can pump actually up to 100% of their water supply as groundwater. However, that water cannot be exported outside of our service area, so all the groundwater has to be used within the district boundaries. We're very much like Santa Clara Valley, special district, groundwater managers. It's just that we're not a state water contractor, CVP contractor, or have access to Hetch Hetchy water. But I will explain where we get our water sources from, because I think it is very important for water districts, groundwater basins particularly, to be able to augment their supplies other than just natural rainfall. So we are governed by a 10-member board of directors. They are the decision makers. 7 are directly elected, 3 are appointed. The cities of Santa Ana, Fullerton, and Anaheim have their city councils appoint their members to our board of directors. As I mentioned, we are a non-adjudicated basin. And each year in April, the second board meeting in April, which is coming up, the board will set the basin production percentage, the BPP, and that's the percentage of groundwater that can be pumped out of the basin. So currently our BPP is 70%. That means anyone within the groundwater basin can pump 70% of their total water demands as groundwater. The other 30% they'd have to purchase from outside sources, in this case the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California. At the same time, the board sets our replenishment assessment, our RA. And the replenishment assessment is what we use as a funding mechanism to help fund our operations and our capital improvement programs. We also set something called the BEA, the Basin Equity Assessment, and I will explain exactly what that is. I mentioned that anyone can